I called this section the lived, living, speaking story in my curatorial statement. And it involved, of course, unlike yesterday where the majority of presenters were actually mostly practicing artists, we have practicing curators, actually 3 of them in this session, and 1 practicing artist. But somehow I consider them beyond just curators. Just by the description of what they're doing. I mean, of course, Nancy, a phenomenal historian and theorist, the level of dedication to excavating content that, or actually reinterpreting meaning from a place of locality and specificity, yet having it have the relevance necessary in connection to the rest of the world in their work is what has moved me and why I invited them to be part of this discussion, because of indeed the nuances of historical meaning that they enlightened through their work. That unfortunately, even in this day, in the so-called super interconnected, globalized world, we still have art history quite lacking in having a worldly representation, especially within the institutions and within the academic circles. You, in fact, have quite antiquated systems here. We're talking about Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan or India or Vietnam, but right here in the United States, in the corners of many of its states, you still have academic institutions that have that really have a very one-dimensional representation of art history and art making. So let's just keep in mind that this is a much bigger, broader story, and it's also not just about the places that each one of you discussed, but how the stories and the perspectives of those places are either not making it beyond those spaces, and or when they are making, they are tainted with a kind of narrative point of view that is based on established institutional readings, particularly Western art historical readings. So on that basis, I would like to invite each of the presenters to actually see if they can say something that they may have not had the time to manage to say that is very important to them to communicate, or elaborate something that they felt they could elaborate on. That's what I would like to open up with. Nancy, do you feel like you said everything about the section we were talking about, feminism and Marxism and collaborative art?
Because it's so lots to say.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm a long play person, so when Leeza told me that it's going to be 20 minutes, I was so terribly nervous. But anyways, thank you for letting me go a little over. And yes, I mean, my Navjot monograph was something that I actually worked on over many years. And what was important is that when I was looking at her background in leftist politics in the early 70s, the history that I write around the progressive youth movement, that history is not even present in the political science textbooks, because this was I mean, this was a movement which doesn't get mentioned anywhere, or if it gets mentioned, there's no analysis of it. And therefore, for the first time in the space of art history, you have a history of Peru. So I think, these are things that I enjoy doing through my research and my writing. And my own background actually is from political science. So when I write art history, it is never just writing art history from a conventional perspective. I have to explore the boundaries of the discipline. And therefore, I state that it's a politics of culture approach. And I think that's very, very important. And that also helps you to get away from received ideas about how we should look at our art. And therefore, for me, this is also an ideological position. Or, for example, when I retrieved the history, the history of the Triennale India from 1968, that was also a lost history of a biennial culture. The Triennale India, when it happened in 1968, it was a very important statement of a confident globalism from the South. And this was state-sponsored, and it was based on the non-alignment philosophy, the Nehruvian idea of internationalism, and of not being a satellite state of either the US or the USSR. So again, the Triennale India was a form of planetary belonging. So you had pavilions of countries who were close to the US, the USSR. It wasn't divided into blocks. And the idea was to actually go beyond this whole Cold War politics. But I think I should.
Okay. Good. Anyone else wanted to add to something in their presentation that they didn't have a chance to?
I would like also, did I tell how much I love artists? No? I do. So I think that in sense of art history, it's the main point. And as artists never pass away, then art is also never pass away, and the history renovate itself in some way. I don't know how, actually. And what I would like to tell now that in my point and to my mind, one of the ways to create art history is to educate new generation of artists. And in our situation when we have not these institutions which you told, or some kind of institutes, whatever. So it's the best way, because when you give from hand to hand to the artist, to the youngest, to your young colleagues, to your lovely students, you tell them what is it about, what it was, what is the past, what is the future. Then it's the main thing, I think. And I know this for sure because I had already a few generations of students, and it's a future, and it's art history. And I again would like to cite Maslow, who said one time that future will never come, we just be in order.
I think I would like to respond to what you said about teaching the future of our artists. I think it's not only about teaching history to the future artists, but also, teaching history, not art history, to the future generation. Because, as you see, the parallel between art history and the history of our time, like in the poster that you show, an artist made a poster on the anti-Vietnam War movement. And for some reason, I think artists have always been on the front line of the political domain, liking it or not, but we somehow feel that this is our responsibility. So if nobody is going to speak out, especially in countries that you can't speak out, sometimes verbally, and then you have to use the visual language to speak out, and maybe it's not enough. So we move beyond that at some point. But it always starts with that, with the visual.
Maybe in line with this idea of this teaching, I think what working with Shakir's practice has been important on many levels, as for the museum as well as for my own kind of understanding of what I do, but also, you know, how curators and artists work together. The exhibition that we had at Mathaf was probably it was one gallery. You saw the entire show in those slides, and it was really kind of uplifting to understand the way that education or learning that happens in the museum through the Learning and Outreach program was really kind of vamped through this show particularly, and the way that obviously the interdisciplinary process of this artist was able to translate into all different kinds of subjects that students were learning. And this is kind of a practice that the museum is experimenting with, is not just teaching students about art through the museum's work, but actually teaching curriculum of maths and science and all sorts of things. And so somehow there was this beautiful marriage of this process happening at the same time as the exhibition itself. And I would say that something, you know, to take that one step further, the process of curating a show that has to be framed, and it has to have a physical presence, and it has to have writing around it, and then actually progressing to study that artist in a way for a PhD, I have had to kind of unpick actually a lot of the way that I created some kind of a narrative. And I think that process has really been very important to think about the work that you do as a museum, as a curator in writing, art histories, but also in connection with the history. And personally, I didn't study art history. I studied history because I was more interested in people, actually, and the way that art is part of society. And so somehow I think this is what I was trying to explain in terms of actually the invitation Leeza gave was to really try and share a bit more about not just an academic or a scholarly perspective on an artist, but actually this dialogue between kind of a curatorial practice and an artist. So perhaps this is helpful in unraveling that a bit more.
Yeah. Yes, I do. A question that I started having yesterday, one of the panels, and now today, actually the closing slides from Stephen was the slides on curatorial activism and the politic of the shock. So I would like to ask you all, how do you fit your practice, curatorial or artistic or theoretical practice, within the notion of activism? Because obviously you have that trigger in your research. So how do you frame it? What kind of, and how does it informs your respective practices? And perhaps Tiffany, you could start, because because one of the things you said towards the end, which I thought was extremely beautiful, was, "I'm not a screamer, I'm a dreamer," which has huge, it's a big statement with a strong power in it, because it says a lot about the potential of being a dreamer, and perhaps even a stronger potential than being an activist shouting out aloud. So could you maybe start, and then if the others would like to intervene and say something on this note, yeah?
Okay, well, thank you for the question. In terms of activism, I think, being an activist and taking things to the street is as important as those of us who sitting here or sitting in our studio doing art as a form of activism. And I think it's really about a category. If you are responsible in your own field practice, you're going to go ahead and do whatever it takes to change the course of history. So, on that note, at the beginning, I didn't really see my work as activism, but it's just a matter of not wanting to be silenced. And another thing is, I question the strategies as well, whether to be an activist and go to the protests. And in Vietnam last year, for the month of May, there was the first time in our recent history that we had massive protest of people just taking things down to the street. Now, you have people just simply going to watch, right, and observe, and they also got arrested. So that really make me question the strategies of how we do this. And I really value the people who just so brave and taking things to the street, but then I also think it's so important for those of us who stay back and use the means and the platforms that we have to make our art being useful. So I have friends, I have artist friends who really go and protest, and they constantly question themselves and ask me, why we even bother to do art? But my answer is, you already have a voice and a platform, and you take it from there. It's so much better than starting from zero. And another thing is, we can wear multiple hats. You can take things to the street. You can sit here on this stage and talk about it and make people aware of the current state of the world.
And I think, Tiffany, it's even more relevant perhaps in Southeast Asia, where there is a strong control, state control. In Vietnam, one of the strongest country, but also I do a lot of research in Thailand, and that would be the same case. So it's a very good point what you are raising. So you can be activist, but you can perhaps do more at the backstage and create that kind of discourse that needs to be brought to the attention. I think operating in Southeast Asia is very different than certainly in the US, at least at this time in history.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I live in Doha, and so there's not really a huge amount of this form of political, physical activism in a way, and so that has been quite interesting. I'm from the UK, and I lived in New York through all of Occupy, and this was a transition that perhaps meant that the practice of working in a place where your work is to kind of find parallel narratives and actually find active, progressive ways of sharing those. That's perhaps where it's a different level of activism in a sense. Meaning that, for example, the histories of art, but also the histories of change, of political change in this kind of transition of post-independence contexts and post-colonial contexts has meant that the not only the histories of those places, but the art histories are also sort of still sort of bubbling in different ways. And so personally, I find it quite interesting to sort of create certain contrasts and parallels, not necessarily to say that these things are the same, but actually to kind of unravel their difference, which I think is quite important in defining, and finding ways to share what's actually happening historically and contemporary.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for both your comments on the subject. Of course, I'm not an activist, but my writing always comes from a very strong ideological preoccupations. And for instance, when I showed the last slide of Rajkumar talking at the Dialogue Center, it's extremely important that if I cannot be an activist and change the situation on the ground, I should at least be a facilitator, a catalyst, to be able to bring voice and visibility to those whose voices are never heard and to people who are never seen within the Indian public sphere. So I think that is something that one can, in a very modest manner, do in one's role as a theorist, as a writer. Another thing is that, I often feel that whenever we are talking from our parts of the world, we sometimes become ambulance chasers. We are always talking about conflict and problems, and somewhere, while we are talking about our conflicts and our problems, and then the Western gaze falls on us, it almost feels like, they're saying, these poor guys, they just can't get their act together, And although we, of course, hate the heart of darkness, and we hate to be put into the heart of darkness, I would say, in a self-critical manner, that we are also acquiescing in that heart of darkness at some level. We are also self-orientalizing, our own conflicts. And this is something that I feel very, consciously about. And therefore, my strategy is to also talk about the heart of light. And while others may revel in the heart of darkness, I would like to gravitate towards the heart of light. I would like to talk about people like Rajkumar, Shantibai, and others who live lives of dignity and who live the life of the imagination, and who are doing that against all odds. So I want to bring to visibility such moments of emancipation as well. I want to say that, yes, I'm coming from a country right now which is ruled by this evil Hindu right-wing regime. And, members of the Dalit community, the Muslim community have faced lynching. Dissenting intellectuals have been murdered. So, of course, it's a terrifying time. But, as against that, I want to continuously also talk about the people who resist. And the people who resist and who've survived despite everything, and who have lived to tell the tale. And I think that should also be our ideological position. I mean, I'm sorry, which part of the world am I talking to? I know, that's also disorienting. But yes, from the global south, of course, when I write about the global south also, I'm very clear, there are parts of the global north which also have the global south in them. So again, these are not binaries. So I think that's something that we need to remember. But I'll keep quiet, sir.
Thank you.
I have a question, unless you do answer.
Just a few words. I think that in the territory of post-Soviet countries, to be an artist is nearly the same to be an activist. So that's it.
Thank you.
I'm not an academic, and I'm not a curator. I'm a practicing artist, and so my question is a little bit from that perspective. And I think one of the takeaways of this conference is to plant the seed of courage for witnesses to your work and to your words to employ some sort of activist, one would hope, premise to their work. But there also surfaces what I would call ethical dilemmas. And a really good example for me is at the height of the AIDS epidemic, when so many people were losing someone, and many, many artists wanted to weigh in about that experience. Much of the work that got made public or was in any way given any kind of audience mostly pointed to the demise of people suffering with AIDS, as opposed to the height of their full humanity as people who were living with a disease, which was different. And so I'm curious to hear from you, who are very fully involved, on where you see ethical dilemmas in planting some sort of impetus for artists to use activism in their work.
Can I say something about that? Since everyone seems to be thinking. It's interesting because, yesterday and today, sometimes we kind of get this is a moment to reflect on also the power of words, because suddenly a word, activism was dropped here, and everything kind of gets tilted. And the fact of the matter is that words are, they have tremendous power, but they are also very limited. They mean so many different things to so many different people. And so I think there was plenty said about activism. For me, it's more about just being able to take a stand for something. And that doesn't have to be called an act of activism. It's just being human. A cat can't take a position. It can only take its own position of its awareness to time, and that itself is tremendous. Maybe we can all learn to be more like cats. But you know, we are beings that categorize. We are beings that yearn meaning. And at the end of the day, it's about how meaning exists in all places, in all times, and in all situations, and they unravel in different ways through different agencies. Agents, and that agent is the container is us, and the container, the energy that flows in the universe is something that flows through us, whether you want to believe it or not. But it's not a matter of faith or science or anything. It's just something that we need to find a way to relate to one another. And the importance of the field meeting as a place of contemplating what we do is to cement what we do further in a sense that it actually reverberates much bigger. You know, that it's not something that we're doing alone, whatever it is that we're doing, and it could just be about aesthetics purely. Because in a sense, it could just be art for art's sake, but to me, I don't think that there is anything like that. There is no such thing as art for art's sake, because we all are not born from a void. We have our autobiographies are tremendously intertwined with the things that we do and what we put out there in the world. What is important is that we do shine the light on the many different narratives and ways of living that has happened throughout history all over the world, and that is part of our responsibility to share with there is no such one perspective. The perspective has been here for centuries and centuries, and that perspective has a journey, and journey of ideas have been traveling, and they're going to continue to travel. And I so appreciated, Nancy, your work in terms of sharing, the fact that enlightenment, this idea that enlightenment happened, 500 years ago in Europe, is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, and the fact that people still go around, walking around on this planet, believing that, and this, and are being sold that story is absolutely ridiculous. And so, for me, part of this work is taking a stand for something like that. That knowledge and wisdom do not belong to to one center or one periphery. It's all places and all at all time. Sorry.
Do we have time for questions? Because Maya, she's waving.
Maya.
Yeah.
Do we have time for questions? Sonia's gonna 2 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, so this is partly trying to tie together a couple of threads that have been, I think, floating around but want to touch one another, and then asking maybe a final question that we can continue to talk about later. I want to borrow a phrase from Nancy, a garland of off-centers. I think this panel was a beautiful example of a garland of off-centers and the way in which this old periphery-center binary has just been completely erased, and we're not paying homage to it anymore. And that each of the presentations basically looked at the complex entanglement of different kinds of factors in a situated, locally specific context that yet tied with much larger processes and problems that cross the globe in different kinds of ways. So as I'm thinking about this garland of off-centers, and I'm thinking about how we can talk about what might constitute a meaningful sort of activism from the positions we already occupy, like what Tiffany said, I think is great. When you have a platform, start there. perhaps that can start with, of course, a self-conscious acknowledgement that, as Leeza said, there is no neutral aesthetic ground, and that the aesthetic strategies that you embrace, whether they're explicitly activist or not, always carry with them and are interpolated with power, always have political consequences and resonances. And to be more self-conscious of that is, I think, an important aspect of the practices of many of the artists who've spoken over the last 2 days in beautiful ways, very inspiring ways. So for me, the question is, how can we braid that garland of off-centers, of the local entanglements and the global resonances? How can we braid that into some kind of useful new kind of discourse, or maybe a rhizomatic rather than centered hub and spokes discourse, but a discourse that allows us to do more than we're doing alone? How do we find a kind of meaningful solidarity through a field meeting like this? Where can we go next? Because I feel like you've all laid the ground for provocations to do more and to do better. And I'm inspired, so where can we start, guys?
Beautiful.
Actually, thank you, Maya, for this remark or question. I think that it's not actually a new issue. And I always remember the words by Charles Escher, who told a few years ago that our aim he meant aim of all art professionals to be totally provincials and not to be, in the center of something. And he told, and people who worked on this project, he told this phenomenon, local modernities. And I think it's just a beautiful idea. We should be provincials, all of us. And then we coming together, all provincials coming together in some point, in some journey, whatever. So just that.
Has a quick answer to that? I think it's probably difficult to do a quick answer to it, right? So it's 12:22. I aim to be in the restaurant at 12:30. So let's see, 1 minute for each of us to answer. Yeah, go ahead if you can.
I mean, I personally think that all of your presentations would be very well received in Doha. I mean, I suppose maybe speaking to a couple of the comments around, this activism, and I mean, I think the work that I and the museum does, and the role of building museums, and the role of cultivating like creative practices in a place like Doha, which is very organically responding to the history of art teaching there or not teaching there, and in dialogue with obviously the wider Middle East, but thinking about the place, the geography of Doha within a wider part of Asia, and in response to these shifting layers of modernity and how those have shaped the history and the art history of that place, I think is where we're kind of coming from. And particularly my work is quite invested not only in the modern art, but working a lot with contemporary artists, and that's where this idea of providing that platform, opening a space. And Leeza's visited Doha and has actually been part of workshops where, it's not just about opening a space for an artist to produce something new and allow that, but actually also thinking about, the responsibilities of working as a curator. How do you give value to your work? And when you're perhaps working in parts of the world where there are, these separations in terms of distance and geographies, but of course the histories, and the connectedness. I mean, a lot of what Tiffany was talking about, is an incredibly strong part of that place in the world, and it's really through these kind of collaborations and really bringing people that it's actually allowing us to share them in a way. And I certainly wouldn't be here if Leeza probably hadn't come to Doha, and so it's maybe that is it's happening. I do think a lot about, what does it mean to maybe create these networks of perhaps institutional connections that you see more and more in Europe and North America, smaller spaces that are relying on each other to kind of figure out ways to work together and independently. And I, kind of fantasize about what that could be. we can discuss that afterwards if you like.
Well, one thing that I keep thinking about is how to rewrite our own history, how to rewrite our own narratives. It's not about just pointing or condemning the kind of narrative and history that don't really reflect our own, but how do we counterbalance that? And I think that's the most important thing. And another thing is, when I came back to Vietnam from the US, from LA, to many people in LA, it was a career suicide because the art world was not in Vietnam. And when I went there were just a few of us coming back from the US. And you know what? We started our own institution. If there's no institution, no platform, we built our own. Because you can't just wait for people to come to you, but you have to start, you have to initiate, for what you need to cater to our community. So that's how we started Sand Art in 2007.
Yeah, my quick 1 minute answer to that wonderful question is, one, go home and reflect, always reflect. You have to have a finger always pointed inwards, like, oh, what am I thinking? What am I saying? There are even works in this forum that I've included, that presentations that I was like, do I like this? Do I really believe in that? I don't know. But it's part of the field. It's happening. It's out there. It needs to be represented. So it's a kind of responsibility to leave kind of like what your brain or what you think is important aside and say, let's see what's actually important and that's going on out there that we could take a risk and look at and question instead of just dismissing it. So going home alone is all of our work. So you have to start with the self and then come back and get together. This is why I do field meeting every year, because I feel like if we all are together and we actually listen and see what we're all doing, we connect to the linkages, we get more fuel, energy inside. I actually believe that this truly gives us the power to go to the next stage with what we're doing. Every person that I've asked to do something here, they haven't come in here and just regurgitated something that they've always done. They've actually taken something, from what I understand, what they've been doing, taking it to a next level, even for this. So I think that the answer is also going to just unfold in time in a very poetic and beautiful way that will absolutely surprise us. Okay, let's go to lunch.